Hello. About 30 years ago, I was going through a bad time. No need to go into details, it was just one of those darker periods in my life. And an old friend, who sadly isn't with us anymore, a really good friend, an old guy, much older than me, he saw that I was having a difficult time around Christmas. And he took me out for a drink in a pub in Newcastle. And it was in that sort of washed out dead time between Christmas and New Year when everybody's a bit knackered. They've had too much turkey and pudding and mince pies, and going out to the pub doesn't seem a particularly attractive option. So we almost had the place to ourselves, and we sat down in the corner near a fire, an actual real log fire, and had a couple of whiskies and just talked and then didn't talk, both equally comfortable. And eventually, he got round to saying something like, "Oh, you like ghost stories? Here's one for you. It was told to me as true, and it concerned his father. Apparently, his dad, during the war, was considered unfit for military service because he'd had TB, tuberculosis, as a child, so his lungs weren't up to much. Still quite a young man, though, so he was put on air raid patrol, ARP warden, going around telling people to put that bloody light out and check the blackout curtains because they were letting a tiny chink of light escape, which could be seen by a German bomb aimer from 20,000 feet, something like that. Point is, of course, that the streets were dark and he had to be very careful not to fall down a manhole or something. So he was picking his way carefully on his rounds one night, around Christmas time apparently, and he had an unusual experience. He was somewhere between the castle, Newcastle Castle, and the old city walls when he heard someone crying, a child crying. And he had a sort of low power torch for the blackout conditions. He sort of shone it ahead of him, and sure enough, he saw a little figure standing in the pavement on the roadway. And this child, as far as he could make out, was in rags and barefoot on a cold winter's night. It was all rather Dickensian. So he naturally, being a kind man, immediately walked up to this child and hunkered down and asked him his name and what he was doing out at night, where his parents were, lots of the usual questions. And the child replied, or at least spoke to him, but not in English, not in any language he recognized. In fact, he thought it might be German or perhaps Dutch. So he formed the logical conclusion that the child, who was very small, about at most 5 or 6 years old, quite scrawny, a little boy, that this child was a refugee who'd been displaced somehow, lost, gone astray, and was just wandering the streets shoeless and in flimsy clothes, looking for help. And this kindly man, my friend's father, took off his coat, his sort of woolen overcoat, big sort of military surplus type thing, and wrapped the child in it and picked him up, noticing that he was very light indeed, virtually a bag of bones, very frail, and carried him off to the nearest police station because that was the only place he could think of to go. There'd be a telephone there, there'd be a warm drink, hot cup of tea or milk or something. There'd be people who could help. They could at least find the child a bed for the night in one of the cells. So he walked through the street, still talking to the child who was still whimpering, crying a bit, and wondering how the little boy had got there. Eventually, they got to the police station and he opened the door, sort of reversed through the door, carrying this burden wrapped up in the woolen overcoat, then walked up to the desk sergeant who was well known to him. The sergeant who was probably, either catching up on some paperwork or maybe doing the pulls, reading the racing results. And my friend's father just put the child, his burden, down on the desk and said, Here's a waif and stray, here's a lost little boy. And then he noticed something. He noticed that, in fact, what he'd just done was put a completely empty overcoat down onto the desk. There was nothing inside it. And his reaction, again, according to my friend, his father's reaction was very human. He sort of did that ridiculous thing where he sort of scrabbled through the overcoat, looking inside as if you could somehow lose a small human being inside a coat, as if he'd slipped into an inside pocket or something. And of course, there was nothing there, except, and this was, I was thinking, interesting. My friend's father said the lining of that coat wasn't as cold as you would think. It should have been if you'd just been carrying it through the night without any living creature inside it. There was just a residual trace of warmth, or so he believed. Well, it was a mystery, and a certain amount of ragging and mockery no doubt took place, but it was a story that was told, it went around, and eventually, over the years, a few other people heard the story and came forward and said, yes, they too had seen or at least heard this child somewhere between the castle and the old city wall on dark nights. And that would have been that, I suppose, if it hadn't been for something that happened in the 1950s. There was some kind of problem with a drain or a sewer or whatever running under the old city walls, the medieval walls that date back hundreds of years. So a team of workmen were allocated to repair this damaged conduit. So they went down and they started digging away, and as is sometimes the way with workmen, they got a bit reckless with the old pickaxe and took a bit more of the actual wall of the drain or something away than they should have done, knocking tiles away or something. And they found a cavity in the foundations of the city wall. And inside that cavity, you won't be surprised to learn, they found the bones of a child, the remains of a boy of perhaps 5 or 6, curled up in the fetal position, knees drawn up, hands clasped around its knees, there obviously for centuries since the walls themselves were built. The remains were interred, of course, given a proper Christian burial, I believe, and from then on there were no more ghostly sightings. One point that my friend asked me about, it seemed quite clear to me, if this was a ghost, well, it's no wonder that his father didn't understand what the boy was saying, because the English he would have spoken would have predated that of Geoffrey Chaucer by a few centuries. The language has changed a lot in all those years. Could, of course, just be one of those anecdotes. I've not seen any evidence to support the claims at all, but there it is. The story of a crying child and a kindly man, a gesture at Christmas, a ghost story. Make of it what you will. I'll just wish you Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.